Some claim that we should be involved economically because there will be unfair distribution of wealth. It won't be equal, but guess what happens in a society that's free? The freer the society, history has proven, the more prosperous the society, and the larger the middle class. But what's happening today? Debasement of currency and government intervention and the special interests, the money gravitates from the middle class to the wealthy. Exactly what's been happening for 30 or 40 years and magnified with the bailouts. So Wall Street, the Goldman Sachs of the world, and the banks and the military-industrial complex, they don't come up short, but the middle class does. Our middle class is shrinking, jobs are tough, the debt burden is on the people, and the bailouts continue. There's one deeply flawed assumption made by the opposition. They believe that debt is good, and that if you're not spending your money, they want you to spend more money. But what if you're maxed out, and what if you don't have a job? How can you spend more money? Oh, they have an answer. The government has to spend the money. But where are they going to get the money? They can't squeeze it out of the people anymore, but they're going to print the money. The fallacy there is the government, it seems like, well, if they print the money and distribute it, wouldn't this help? But do they distribute the money to the people? Did they go and bail out the mortgage holders? No, they went and bailed out the banks. If I had to make a choice on whether I wanted to live in a totally free society and be poor, I would want to live in a totally free society. That's what would be my personal choice. But we never have to make that choice. If you decide that you want to live in a free society and protect property rights and contract rights and sound money and limited government, guess what? That's where the greatest prosperity comes from. So if we are truly humanitarians and we care about our fellow man, I don't know how you could give up on the principles and the cause of liberty and private property rights. That's where prosperity comes from. In the early part of the last century, we concentrated more on the materialism of what is produced, and therefore we used the government to play favorites, redistribute wealth, help one group or another. And for decades, they were able to get away with it because the production was so great and there was so much prosperity that they were able to get away with this mischief. But it's different now. What you're coming into is an age where that system has ended because we are no longer the wealthiest country. Now we're the biggest debtor nation, not in the world, but in the world history.
If you're of college age right now and you have enough intelligence to sit down and crunch a few numbers, and you're able to look at things like the national debt, the constant deficits, the budget is not balanced, and the growth of government and so on and so forth, you realize very quickly that the system that you're paying into through things like the income tax and Social Security in particular, is not going to be solvent by the time a 20, 25-year-old college student reaches the age of retirement where they would be ready to draw those benefits that they've paid into for all those years. You're paying into something that you're never going to see the benefit of. Why would a young person want to continue to pay into that system?
A lot of people are worried about the government's debt, and the thing that's really troublesome about that is a lot of times people quote the statistics and they say, oh, what's the debt to GDP ratio? And oh boy, if we continue on this path by 2020, 2025, we're really in trouble. But the thing is, that's not really the relevant issue. The relevant issue is not just the money that the Treasury officially owes to people in terms of bonds, but it's the obligations that Uncle Sam is on the hook for in terms of Social Security and Medicare and so forth. Because there, depending on how you calculate those things, the U.S. government right now is in debt more than the entire output of planet Earth, right? I mean, it's not, it's in the 10s and 20s and 30s and so forth, again, depending which estimate you look at, of trillions of dollars. I've seen estimates as high as $70–80 trillion is what the U.S. government is in the hole actuarially, going forward over the next 100 years. And so, I mean, it's not going to be paid. There's no way out of that. It's going to have to default either through running the printing press that way, or by cutting benefits, or by really jacking up taxes, or all three. And I think people are just in this naive la-la land where they just think, oh, well, that's going to be painful. Someone's going to have to deal with that, but not us. And it's getting closer where it's going to have to be dealt with very soon.
Ron Paul's message makes sense to young people because they know that they have really nothing invested anymore. Well, let me put that a different way. They have everything invested, but they have no return on their investment because they're not going to be able to draw Social Security in 40 years because if you crunch the numbers, it's insolvent. It won't be there in 40 years.
Just to give you an idea, the Paul Ryan plan that everyone's talking about, this draconian slashing and oh my gosh, this crazy right-wing plan that guts the government, the plan itself, if you go look at it, doesn't even promise to balance the budget until the year 2041. So Paul Ryan's own plan, in its own numbers with rosy projections, says that the government will spend more than it takes in revenue through the year, I think it's 2041. And so, I mean, that should just give people some idea of how in debt the government is when this crazy radical plan to cut spending has that kind of outcome.
The whole world is in trouble financially because it's the biggest financial bubble in the history of the world. And it's all based on the fiat dollar. Because it's a dollar-denominated world currency, we were able to issue the currency. It's sort of like being able to issue the gold. So all the other currencies use the dollar as the base. And therefore, they have inflated in a distorted thing. And a typical example to understand that is what's happening in Greece. We're in the middle of that mess over there. And I've always said, and I continue to be convinced it's happening, that is, you will get the burden of bailing out Europe. And that is the reason that we have to know exactly what the Federal Reserve is doing, get control of the Federal Reserve, have an audit of the Federal Reserve, and find out who they're bailing out. The appetite for this huge government to do things they shouldn't be doing, where do they get the rest of the money? They print it.
I have seen Ron Paul on the Debate Economics, and I think it's very interesting. It's very enlightening. I learn something every time I hear him talk. I think the people who try to debate, even the people who are arguing against him, learn something, even if they don't want to admit it. And it's interesting to see some of the deeply held beliefs about the Great Depression or about boom and bust cycles or whatever being shaken to their core. It's like the whole story of the emperor with no clothes on, and there's just one little boy who's willing to point up and laugh and say, you don't have any clothes on. Well, Ron Paul's and he's not a little boy, he's an old man. But he's still like the little boy pointing his finger at the emperor and saying, "You don't have any clothes on. What you're doing is a shell game. It's a scheme." And if people would really think about it, I mean, nobody would run their personal finances the way the government runs our corporate finances. Where if you have a problem because you're in a lot of debt, well, let's get more debt. And it's not even really strategic.
The economy that we have now, young people we're facing a really hard time. Are we going to be able to, have a job? Is it secure? Can we get a house? I mean, it's a scary time, and I think the young our generation, we're really looking at that, and we see that Ron Paul represents what we're looking for in the future of America.
The opposite of freedom would be slavery, correct? I mean, so you have freedom or you have slavery. And of course you have that middle there that I don't know what you call it. But you should always fight for it because nobody wants to be a slave. We are slaves right now. How are we slaves right now? You might ask. People are like, oh, we're not slaves. We are slaves right now. The government can come in, or they do. They come in every year, and they say that this portion of your income is going to go to them. 30% of your work goes to them. That is a form of slavery. We do not get to keep what we work for. We have to give it back to the government. That's slavery. Like, there's no argument against that. It is slavery. So we have to give this to them. If not, what happens? They come and arrest us, put us in handcuffs, and take us to prison. Now, would you say prison slavery? I mean, you see what I'm saying? So, the opposite of freedom is slavery, and we have to realize that we have to constantly fight for this freedom. That's why the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 is so important to repeal. I mean, we got to get rid of that.
What happened 16 years later after the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank? We had the Great Depression, and I'm sure the Federal Reserve Bank wouldn't like to take credit for that, but it happened under their watch. And then what ended up happening 4 years after the Great Depression of 1929, after its inception, Glass and Steagall, who were two congressmen, came up with the Glass-Steagall Act that created the FDIC, and it separated commercial banks and investment banks from one another. And those two banking entities separated from one another, they figured would be the best way to try to make sure that this Great Depression didn't happen again. What ended up happening in 1999 under Bill Clinton's administration is 3 Republican congressmen, Graham, Leach, and Bliley, formed the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999, which basically went against Glass-Steagall and allowed commercial banks and investment banks to now merge together. For example, you had something like Citibank and Travelers Group merged to Citigroup, an investment bank and an insurance agency in this example, and so they merged together and formed Citigroup, a very powerful entity. What ended up happening is it set off the subprime mortgage market because there was no checks and balances amongst the banks anymore, because now Glass-Steagall was effectively neutered because of that new law, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. And so now all of a sudden Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac started backing all of these mortgages through all these banks. And the Federal Reserve Bank kept printing the money for that. And then they kept printing the money. The banks kept lending it to, if you breathed and you wanted a loan, you got one, 100%, sometimes up to 120% of the time. So what that did was it created the subprime mortgage bubble because you had bad creditors who were borrowing money, getting a home loan, and then 9 years later, all our economy came to a grinding halt. Just like really the Great Depression, we had the Great Recession.
The average person who's worried about the economy should learn Austrian economics. It doesn't mean you have to delve into thousands and thousands of pages of it, but just to get a basic familiarity, because first of all, most important, just to understand what the heck happened, right? To understand that it wasn't just that the economy was chugging along and all of a sudden the bottom fell out, and it also wasn't because there was this deregulation and all of a sudden all the wise bureaucrats were asleep at the wheel and all these greedy businessmen decided to throw a party. That's also not really what happened. So I think just to understand what happened, and then because you need an educated public to support political programs and so forth that make sense, that's only going to happen when people educate themselves, but also to see what's coming. And that if you learn Austrian economics, you know that we're not through this crisis yet, and you know that you need to really sort of batten down the hatches, save as much as possible, acquire precious metals as a way to protect yourself from this really bad crisis that I think is going to still come. We just don't know exactly when.
It's clear we want to end the Fed. Everybody knows that. The Fed is an abomination, and it just encourages inflation and malinvestment, and pretty much the people who are closest to the government who get the money first benefit while everybody else suffers. But what do we do next? Well, you can't just end the Fed overnight. The catastrophic consequences on the economy would be unacceptable, and that's something Ron Paul says every time he's asked about it. He doesn't actually advocate going to a pure gold standard like some people claim that he does. What he suggests doing is having a competition environment where people can choose what they want to be money. Now, all you have to do legislatively to accomplish this is to get rid of legal tender laws and take off the taxes on gold and silver, capital gains, etc., so that you can put your money in whatever type of monetary instrument you want without it costing you a fee to switch. So, like, by doing that, people could remain in the dollar, or they could, let's say, a bank might come out and they might say, we'll give you notes. One note equals one certain unit of gold. That would immediately happen in the market. So, and beyond that, you've got algorithms now, kind of like what Google has, which can make baskets of currencies and commodities and trade them at high-speed frequencies to try and maintain strength. People would be allowed to use a lot of different monetary products, which are actually much more modern and sophisticated than printing money, which is the, you know, the 900 AD's best monetary system.
When an organization steals 98% of the value of your dollar that you work for every day, you get 98% of it stolen from you, and you don't care, that makes you the dumb person, not me. So call me crazy, but you're the dumbass for going out and working for $10 an hour, and $9.80 of the value of it is gone. So, you know, what am I going to do? All I can do is tell you, you go find out.
The Fed either does too much or too little, and they can't do it. So they don't have a very good record. They've ruined 98% of the value of the currency since 1913. And that's dishonest. That steals value from people. Why should people get 1% for the money for savings and the banks get it for practically free and they make money? Why did the Federal Reserve bail out the rich? Why didn't they give the money to the mortgage holders? If you care about poor people,
so Representative Paul,
houses, why didn't you use helicopters? Why didn't you use helicopters and pass it out to the home builders? That would have been more fair.
Well, what is your prescription then for what should the Fed do? I mean, should we not have a Federal Reserve? I mean, what should the role of the Fed be? You talked about Milton Friedman. He said, hey, why not replace the Fed with a computer? What is it going to come to?
I'm with him.
You're with him.
I'll tell you what we could do, and even with my book and the Fed, if you read it, it doesn't call for the end of the Fed, because it would be chaotic if tomorrow we ended the Fed. Too many people dependent. But all I want to do is get rid of the monopoly. I want to legalize competition. There's legal competition on currencies around the world. Why can't we allow ourselves here the legal competition over gold or silver standard? Why was the Fed so frightened about this? And then, if I'm wrong,
I have no idea what that's about.
Who cares? If I'm right, if you want the paper money and I'm wrong, it doesn't hurt anybody. Just allow me to legalize the currency, get rid of the monopoly, take the taxes off gold and silver, and get rid of the sales tax and capital gains tax and get in legal tender laws. Don't hide behind a monopoly and force. People today, if they use gold and silver, you can go to jail in this country.
Do you really think that people... That's not my understanding of the law. But do you really think that people use dollar bills only because the federal government isn't allowing them to use other stuff? That seems to me to be a very strange point of view. And by the way, we have lots of private money.
You don't have a choice. You go to jail if you use anything else. You go to jail.
That's not what I've heard. You can do barter. You can do barter with all kinds of stuff. No, the fact of the matter is that we actually had too much currency competition, too much money competition, right? This crisis was brought on by an expansion of what amounted to private money in the form of things like repo, which were uncontrolled and turned into an enormous crisis when they collapsed. So, but look,
okay,
I mean, just come back to
if a private company commits fraud, they go to jail. If the Federal Reserve commits fraud, they get nothing. I mean, you can do whatever you want. So if you had private issue of money and you committed fraud, you would go to jail for this.
If you think that,
but no, governments can debase a currency and injure a lot of people, cause the business cycle, cause the inflation, cause the unemployment, and they get off scot-free.
I've been pretty harsh on
our understanding.
I've been pretty harsh on Ben Bernanke, but fraud is not one of the things I would charge him with.
Well, Dr. Krugman, if we can...
You want them to print more money faster. Believe me, it doesn't work. We have enough evidence for that.
What's interesting is Paul Krugman, arch Keynesian economist, had a debate with Dr. Ron Paul, and early on in the exchange, Dr. Paul presented his views, and then Krugman gets up and he just rolls his eyes and says, "Oh, the government has to do something. The Fed has to do something. I mean, we need to have intervention in money." And he said, in a very interesting thing, he said, I mean, it's at the point where, Dr. Paul's views are like 150 years ago, but now, I mean, things are so complex, we don't even know how to define money, really. We don't know the dividing line between, actual money and credit transactions with shadow banking. So if you just step back and think about what he was saying we need to have a centralized government, bureaucrat-run monopoly on something that we can't even define. And that doesn't make any sense. It's the exact opposite, that if it made sense 150 years ago to have a free market-determined money, well, then all the more so it makes sense now if Krugman is admitting he can't even define what money is.
You can't leave the government out of monetary policy. If you try to think, we're going to just let it set itself, it doesn't happen. The government is actually always, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, is always going to be in the business of managing monetary policy. If you think that you can avoid that, you're living in the world as it was 150 years ago, right? We have an economy in which money is not just green pieces of paper with faces of dead presidents on them. Money is the result of the financial system. It includes a variety of assets. We're not even quite sure where the line between money and non-money is. It's kind of a continuum. And look, history tells us that, in fact, a completely unmanaged economy is subject to extreme volatility, subject to extreme downturns. I know there's this legend that people like, probably you, Congressman, have, that the Great Depression was somehow caused by the government, caused by the Federal Reserve, but it's not true. The reality is that was a market economy run amok, which happened repeatedly over the past couple of centuries. You do need, I'm a believer in the market economy. I'm a believer in capitalism. I want the market economy to be left as free as it can be, but there are limits. You do need the government to step in to stabilize. Depressions are a bad thing for capitalism, and it's the role of the government to make sure that they don't happen, or if they do happen, that they don't last too long.
Congressman Paul, we've been talking a lot about inflation here on the set today, and it's a policy that Professor Krugman is really saying that the Fed should put forward. In other words, we need a little inflation in this economy to get things going. What do you say to that?
Well, inflation is theft. You're stealing value from people who save money. So if you have a 2% or a 10%, the value of the currency is lost. And it really destroys an important feature of the economy, and that is savings. Savings tells us something, and it tells us if capital is available. This notion that capital can come out of the expansion of the money supply is remote. Now, Professor Krugman indicates that we just want to go back 100 years or so. That is not exactly true. We'd like to improve on what was like back then, but he wants to go back 1,000 years or 2,000 years, just as the Romans and the Greeks and all other countries debased their currency. They didn't have a computer. This idea that we need a Federal Reserve to run things, well, federal or a central bank, that's just a modern era.
Now
and
Representative Paul, can you clarify, what do you mean by go back 1,000 years? Is that fair? Clarify what you mean by that.
What did the Romans do to their currency? The Byzantine Empire had a gold standard for 1,000 years, and they did quite well, and they didn't fight wars. But the Roman Empire eventually destroyed their currency. They put in wage and price controls before. They diluted the metals. They inflated. They thought wealth could come by fooling the people. Who would want today, if they had 10 years to send their kid to college, would they put their money in gold coins or a treasury bill making 1 or 2%? They can't keep up with the inflation or the devaluation of the currency. There'd be nothing there. Nobody puts their money in a 10-year bond.
Here's something interesting. We live in a debt nation. Everything's based on credit. It's not really based on savings. So, our country, though, we just print money and raise that debt. So I think the people are kind of going along with the country. They get the credit card, they run it up, and it's a cycle, and the bankers know what's up. They know what's going to happen. They know if they make credit really easy to get, that people are just going to run those credit cards. They may not need that credit, right? So our country, though, has an appetite for being in debt, and our government does too. So the people do, and the government does. So we're really a country in debt, and we live off of just having them print money and owing money. So we'd have to change that whole appetite of being in debt, because it sounds weird that we have an appetite as people of being in debt, but we really do if you think about it. And when I say that, we have an appetite of taking out loans. You owe somebody instead of saving money. You know, people would save and put down payments and, you know, for instance, like cars. You know, why would you take out a loan for something that's going to depreciate in value? You're going to lose money. It makes no sense.
Inflation is a hidden tax, and I think Ron Paul is right to be hammering on this issue. And he takes a lot of heat from supposedly sophisticated economists, and they're going to say, oh my gosh, all these Ron Paul people crying about the Fed when in the grand scheme of things, inflation's not really that big a deal. And so what the principle is it's pretty straightforward, and I almost think these economists who try to poo-poo the notion are too clever by half. They're overanalyzing it. It's very simple. Just like you personally would benefit if you had a printing press in your basement and you didn't have to go work at a job, you could just print off $100 bills and buy stuff. Well, that concept still holds true for the government. Now, it gets a little bit complicated because the Federal Reserve creates the new money, and then the banking system is allowed to pyramid new money creation on top of that. So it's not just the government, it's not just the Fed, it's also the commercial banks that are all in on this neat little trick of creating money out of thin air. But the point is, if there's a group of people out there who can create money just out of thin air through their operations, obviously they are redistributing the existing resources, the existing goods into their hands and out of the hands of the people who don't have access to that money when it first comes out. So it's a very simple concept, and it's amazing that so many people can try to analyze it away.
It is very unique that you know, the Liberty Movement has a focus on monetary policy, and that we have a politician in Ron Paul who's very conversant on it. I just kind of am a little concerned that we live in an environment where that is unique. I feel kind of nervous. I feel like we should live in an environment where all politicians know about it, because it's pretty serious. It's pretty much the #1 economic thing. More than anything else, what the rules about money are. It's much more significant than regulations about what kind of milk is allowed to be in ice cream. I mean, that's just irrelevant compared to the damage that can be caused when somebody prints an extra $1 trillion more than they're supposed to in the economy and gives it to somebody who wasn't supposed to have gotten it. It creates so much hardship and eventually war at the other end of the discord it creates in society. So I wish that we had more politicians who could go on CNBC and not look like an idiot, but we really don't. We don't have that many that can talk on anything other than huge, foolish sound bites who pretty much get all of their economic information from Goldman Sachs. And that's why when you see Barack Obama, Mitt Romney, majority of their money is coming from Goldman Sachs, from these huge Wall Street firms, then really the majority of their money is coming through something that, you know, Goldman Sachs is kind of like a money laundering firm for the world's wealthiest people, in a way. So whoever's being funded by that is probably somebody that shouldn't be voted for, because they're just going to give the money back to them. We've seen it how many times now?
If you look at what one of the Rothschilds said in the 1800s, he said, you know, let me print the money, and I care not who makes their laws. Let me print the money of a nation, and I care not who makes the laws, because he can buy and sell everybody. All these people, think about how powerful this organization is. That's why we need a mass number of people fighting them. If I have the ability to print money, if I could just go to my press and print money and then go spend it however I wanted to spend it, that would be just an amazing thing. I'd be able to buy whatever I wanted to. I'd be able to buy whoever I wanted to get them to do whatever I wanted them to do. And so when that happened in 1913, our country was hijacked. We never had an income tax. We didn't have an income tax until 1913. There was no IRS. There was no IRS. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says we have to pay taxes. And you know, the whole tax protester movement, there's been some good people go to jail. Was it Irvin Schiff, Peter Schiff's dad, political prisoner in jail for not paying his taxes. And it's funny when I see the government or the media paint the picture of these people, and you hear the arguments in court saying, oh, he just doesn't want to pay his taxes. And then the juror's like, oh, well, we have to pay our taxes, so he's just trying to get a fast one over. No. I said, do you think somebody would risk prison trying to just not pay, you know, $20,000 a year, $15,000 a year, whatever? No, he's making a point. We don't have to. He's doing it for those jurors. He's not even doing it for him. He's sacrificing. He's going to prison. Not for himself. He's going not for trying to pull a fast one on the government. He's going to prison fighting for those same jurors that are putting him in jail.
Your children, my children, before they're even born, they're already responsible for their individual portion of the federal debt right now, I think is around $50,000. You're born into debt slavery in the United States because our federal budget right now, the debt is over $15 trillion, I believe, at this point. And we're still running, multi-billion-dollar deficits. It's financial and economic, but it's also human. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, right? Well, we can all try to pursue happiness, but if the government takes away your liberty, then there is no pursuit of happiness. And remember that if the government is able to take away your liberty, then the next thing it's going to be able to take away is your life.
Rights come to us not from our government. Our rights come from our Creator in a natural way. Our liberties come in the same manner. Unfortunately, the consequence of that understanding should be that if you have your right to your life and the right to your liberty, you ought to have the right to keep the fruits of your labor. We defend the system because we all agree on liberty, but we're unconcerned about how we use our liberty. We should protect everybody's right to their life and their liberty. You can use your life in a productive way or in a destructive way as long as you assume responsibility and as long as you get the rewards, that you can use your life as you choose. And the same way, you ought to be able to use your money as you choose and get to spend your economic money as well, But we have drifted from that we don't have trust in the people and understanding. I think many people fear liberty, and they fear that you won't spend your money right. I've had members of Congress tell me when they were voting on a law that was telling you what to do with your personal life, well, people are too dumb. They have to have politicians tell them what to do. But let me give you a hint of what's really going on in Washington. I know a few of those people up there. I know some politicians, I know some bureaucrats, and they're not smart enough to tell you what to do with your life or your money. They don't know what is best for you, and if they make a mistake, which they on occasion do, they make it for all of us. If you make a mistake, if you have your liberty back and you make a mistake, you suffer the consequences. And there'll be other, it's not like saying nothing would happen. It would mean that the government can't come in if you've done harm to yourself and it was your responsibility. Yes, you can get help from family, friends, neighbors, churches, or whatever, but to devise a whole system that says that if you get into trouble, you have to go to the government to spend money on this, buy this, do this. When people come to me and they say, I want the government to take care of this problem. I said, well, who's the government? Where's the government going to get their money? The only money the government has is the money they steal from people. And they do that in a seductive manner. They do it seductively because sometimes it's through direct taxation, and that's pretty obvious. If we had to pay our taxes on a monthly basis individually for all the government we get, this whole system would quit because everybody would know, hey, we're not getting our money's worth. So they don't do that. They get as much as they can, then they destroy the economy, and because of the weak economy, the revenues go down. So they have to have another source of revenue, and that's borrowing money, something Jefferson tried to prevent.
It's true that just using sort of value-neutral economic science, I think there's a strong, compelling case to be made for what I call sound money that ties up with the views that somebody like Ron Paul would advocate. But also just beyond that, with my own personal morality and my Christian faith, I do think that what the government is doing right now is immoral. So it's not merely that, it's inefficient or it's not going to promote prosperity, but I think that deep down, there's something just immoral about what they're doing, that it is, in a sense, legalized counterfeiting. And if you ask yourself, if you saw your neighbor who had perfected, had tweaked his printer and had the software set up so he was cranking out $100 bills in his basement, it's not merely that you would say, oh my goodness, that's going to upset the distribution of resources. That's a suboptimal. You'd say he's stealing from everybody. That's not right. He's not working. He's stealing. He's able to go get goods and services with that money he just printed up, or that fake money that he didn't work for, that he didn't contribute. And so there's something wrong about that. And also, I think if we actually did have a society where people used a genuine commodity money, like gold or silver coins, where it was in your pocket and it was tangible and it was real, I think that would psychologically ground people. That whereas now with the bailouts and just saying, oh, well, Bernanke's going to print $1 trillion and oh, I hope Bernanke can save the economy, it makes people like just dependent on the whim of this one guy and hopefully he can just print a bunch of money. Beyond me disagreeing with the economic analysis there's something really creepy about that I don't think that's healthy for a culture to have that sort of value system or those expectations.
Our economy is in shambles because both the Democrats and the Republicans spend money, I would say like drunken sailors, but that's insulting to drunks and sailors for no good reason. But it just, but one side will say, okay, well, we need money for the warfare state. The other side will say we need money for the welfare state. Both vote for each other's bills. We keep just raising the debt ceiling over and over again, and nobody comes in and says, hey, this just can't go on indefinitely. You are enslaving somebody's great-great-grandkids to pay for decisions we're not willing to make now. We want to do cradle to grave for everybody, and then we wanted to blow up bridges around the world and then spend money to rebuild those same bridges, and it's just not sustainable.
There is a monetary collapse coming, and it'll be the most significant historical event that any of us have been alive for, and it'll be one of the most significant historical events with one of the widest spread impacts on us all in all of human history, in all of recorded human history. And it's not going to be fun, and it is inevitable. If you look at the graph of the adjusted monetary base, it goes like this in 2007. They broke our money. They broke our fake fiat money system, and this is coming. It's a matter of when. Peter Schiff says it's going to happen in 2013. Don't take it from me. I'm a blogger. I'm just a kid who writes about stuff. Peter Schiff is a financial analyst who predicted the housing collapse and the financial crisis. Now he's predicting a monetary crisis that's going to hit our money itself. I would listen to him. I am listening to him. I believe him. I'm taking it seriously. Ron Paul, Gerald Celente, all the people who saw it coming are saying that there's a monetary collapse coming. So it's not a matter of if, it's just when, and there's not a lot of time left. And so the question isn't, can we hold it off? The question is, when it happens, will enough people be awake that we realize what the problem was and we fix it instead of doing what we've always done throughout human history when there's a crisis and ask for more of the poison in the first place and think that it's medicine? If we haven't unplugged enough people by then, it could get lots worse in this country. It could be Alex Jones kind of scenario, police state. It won't be good because people will be afraid. They won't understand why the crisis has happened, and they'll listen to the political leaders that will use the crisis as a premise for yet more government, for police statism in this country, for all kinds of horrible things. Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste, and they won't when this happens. So it's going to be a real fight for the heart and soul of this country when it does. So there's not much time, and we have to start working now. We have to start working harder. Whatever you're doing, do a little bit more, because there's not much time left, and we have to make sure this country's awake when the crisis hits.
In my view, this really is the second Great Depression. And I think it's very naive when people think that, okay, we're in this recovery, but it's real sluggish. There technically was a rebound in the 1930s as well. That wasn't just one long recession technically. There was a recovery, and then they had another relapse and so forth. And so I think it's a similar thing going on right now. If you understand the Austrian diagnosis of what Alan Greenspan did wrong, right? There was the dot-com boom and then bust, in 2000, and then Alan Greenspan brought interest rates way down, and he gave us the housing bubble. And it gave us a few years of apparent prosperity that obviously blew up in our faces. And by 2008, people realized, oh my goodness, if only we had just suffered through the dot-com bubble, that would have been a walk in the park compared to this thing. And so my worry is that that's what Ben Bernanke's doing to us right now. That I don't know when it's going to be, 3 or 4 years from now, when treasuries perhaps are realized to be in a bubble and interest rates go way up. Perhaps governments in Europe start falling because they're so broke. Who knows exactly how it's going to manifest itself, but I think people will realize, go figure, printing trillions of dollars and money out of thin air didn't make the world economy suddenly fixed. And that they're going to realize, oh, if only we could go back to the housing bubble, that would have been a walk in the park compared to what we're dealing with now in 2020. And so I realize that's a dire prognosis, but that's what I think is happening, and the only way we're going to fix things is for people to realize that and for governments to change their policies and go back to something more sane.
What happens when a hyperinflation hits? I mean, if you really look at it, what's going to happen in the country if hyperinflation hits? And do people know what hyperinflation is? We'll put it in simple terms. What if gas was $15 a gallon? What if a loaf of bread was $50? What if a gallon of milk was $50? What would happen in the country? How catastrophic would that be? Would people starve? How would they react? My prices here wouldn't go up, but all of a sudden the cost of everything has skyrocketed. It happened in the 70s. We weren't in near as much debt in the 70s, though, when that happened. Now, if hyperinflation hits, it's going to be catastrophic. I mean, we can't even imagine what the effect would be. What's going to happen if hyperinflation hits? The government's going to come in and try to help us. They're going to try to save us. And we have our guard up when that happens. And it's going to be interesting to see how I react and how the Ron Paul people react. Because, do we take the help from the government? I don't know. Do we let them disarm us? If they say, okay, it's going to be martial law, we're going to come get everybody's guns because we can't have, people with guns right now. Do we allow that to happen? If we allow that to happen, what happens when they disarm us? What are we going to do if they disarm? Okay, how do we defend ourselves now? If they want to come and get us. Now, don't get me wrong. If 20 policemen or 20 SWAT team members or 20 whatever federal police force, I don't know what you call them, come in the middle of the night and storm my house, they're going to get me no matter how many guns that I have or no matter how many guns anybody has. But as a nation, as an armed nation, they can't raid all of us at the same time. And, I think that the line that we need to draw is you're not ever going to take away our guns. There's no way. What a lot of people don't realize about the Second Amendment, everybody thinks it's self-defense. The Second Amendment was written to rise up against a tyrannical government. That's why it's in there. The self-defense was a second thought. The sole reason for the Second Amendment was to rise up if the government got too powerful. We can never let them take our guns away. You can't do it. That's it. It's over for America at that point. Even if they say they're going to give them back, we have to take them away for a short amount of time. No, there's no way. That's the end of America right there. And that's the danger of hyperinflation. See, people think that the terrorists overseas, the terrorists are the biggest threat to our country. No, hyperinflation is the biggest threat to our country, no doubt about it. Hyperinflation is the biggest threat to our country. And if it hits, the country will change forever. It could change for the better because we could really take it back. Or it could change for the worse, and we could live with a dictator and lose all of our rights. And I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I hope that never happens. But I mean, the debt's piling on. They just going to keep printing money. We're at $15.6 trillion in debt right now. They're not talking about making any cuts. They're talking about making cuts to increases. And the American people are like, oh, they want to make cuts. They're not making cuts. They're making cuts to increases. Instead of raising the debt ceiling by $5 trillion, or raising the national debt by $5 trillion, we're going to raise it by $4 trillion. We just saved $1 trillion. And the people buy it. They believe it. They're like, oh, we just saved $1 trillion. They have such a, no, this is awful. It's a disaster. We've been fooled. Stop watching mainstream media. Stop watching the TV. Turn it off. Turn it off. Stop listening. Go on the internet.
One of the main problems with standard financial reporting, the news media, and their discussions and commentary is they really think that the stock market is a barometer of good economic policy. Like if Ben Bernanke gets out and says something and stocks go down, everybody thinks, oh, that means it was a bad thing, or vice versa. If something happens, stocks go up. But I mean, if Geithner comes out and announces a big bailout and is going to shovel a bunch of money into Wall Street and a bunch of financial stocks go up, that's not surprising, but that doesn't mean it was necessarily a good thing. So I think that's one of the things that bothers me about the standard mainstream financial media is that they use the stock market as this indicator of good economic policy.
Austrian economics is very much free market capitalism, and I really like it. I don't know, I'm not an economist, but I certainly like what I hear, because my thought is that's what a Republican form of government should stand for, is for free market capitalism. And that's what we need, and that's really not what we have. And the big reason is that government's involved, and the government is heavily involved with things like federally guaranteed student loans. And now we have $1 trillion of student loan debt, and I'm making the prediction right now we're about to have another big economic bubble, and that's because there's all of these people going to college in the United States, and there's all these federally guaranteed student loans, and there's no jobs to go to. So at some point there's going to be a massive default, and when there is, our economy is going to grind right back into the ground. And that's because there's no risk to bankers. If you breathe and you want a student loan, they'll give you one 100% of the time. And so that you can't do that. There has to be risk involved. Bankers have to have risk. And when the government steps out of anything, it immediately helps everything, because if the government wouldn't back these student loans, then there would be heavy risk with the bankers, and they would start questioning each individual student, finding out if they were going to lend to this person or not. But now that the government's involved in doing federally guaranteed student loans, and there's no risk, what that does is it continues to raise tuition, because market economics tells us that right now, if you've got lots of demand, then if I'm a university trustee or a chancellor and I make the call on tuition prices, I'm going to raise the price. So our inflation rate goes up every year, but our tuition rate goes up way above the inflation rate.
Plenty of people went to college before the government got involved. It just didn't cost nearly as much. People didn't graduate college with a mortgage. Now they do.
I don't
but the
think
problem
colleges are setting prices based on how much students can take out of
yeah,
banks.
Of course. No, they're basing their prices on the fact that students can borrow money with government guarantees. If the government got out of the market...
I think there's more to it than that.
No, there isn't. That's exactly the problem.
I disagree.
If the government got out of the market, students couldn't borrow money so cheaply. Interest rates would rise, and students wouldn't be able to bid up prices.
Right,
Colleges
so then you get to decide who gets to go to college, and so only rich students get to go to college. That's a very good message to send.
It's not up to the government to pay for everybody's college degree, and you don't have a right to go to college. I mean, people should go to college.
I think everybody should have the opportunity to go to college, and I don't think you should decide who gets to go to college.
No, I'm not
and who
deciding
gets to have
it, but by subsidizing it, they create this huge bubble. Do you think students are really better off? I've had plenty of students on my radio show. The biggest regret in their life is that they went to college, because now they're stuck with an enormous debt. I had one young woman on my show.
They're stuck with a low innovation economy that's not creating the right type of jobs.
Well, the reason they're not creating the jobs is the government is diverting all the capital to education, and it's not going to businesses.
Of all the things the government is spending money on, I hardly would suggest that I would be hard-pressed to find somebody that would suggest that investing in college education is a bad investment.
Yeah, you found me. It's a lousy investment. We are squandering our wealth.
subsidizing investment, and when that's the case, then we've got a real problem on our hands, because the only way forward, the only way to invest in our future is through education.
No, not everybody
needs
growth. Not everybody needs a college degree. This is what you're doing is playing into the universities and the colleges.
I'm not saying everybody needs a college degree, but anybody who wants to go to college should get to go to college. They should have that opportunity.
They have the opportunity without the government.
For it? I mean, who's paying for it? I mean, our taxpayers once again on the hook here.
Like with other things, like with entitlement programs, like with the housing sector, of all of the things that taxpayers would be on the hook for, I would argue that education is probably one of the least controversial.
Oh, it is very controversial. And, you know, because of the government, today, a college degree is not worth the price that you pay for it. Not only in the cost, but the 5 or 6 years that you're not in the labor force. But if we simply got the government out of education, college tuitions would plunge. Colleges would be forced to compete.
I do not agree with that. I do not think
basic economics.
I think there's. I'm well aware of basic economics. Thank you. But I would argue that. Yes, I am. Thank you. But I would argue that there's a lot more variables at play in a college. How college prices its tuition as opposed to.
Prices are determined by supply and demand. If you take away the demand by taking away the guaranteed loans, colleges will have to stop building these fancy gymnasiums and these fancy, campus housings or the big restaurants. They'll have to cut prices. They'll have to cut the pay of some of their administrators and bureaucrats.
They'll have to cut their faculty. They'll have to cut their technology.
No.
They'll have to cut their investment.
No,
Absolutely.
they won't. No.
Yes, they will.
The technology will probably increase. Look, in the 1950s, students got great educations in college, and it didn't cost anything. Kids used to work their way through college, and they graduated debt-free
and there were
with
jobs
degrees.
For them.
I know.
You know what? We're gonna agree to disagree because these are all very, very good points.
Federal Reserve, you've been living hell to me. You've been robbing me since 1913.
My name is Jim Sandman. I'm a field coordinator with the John Birch Society, and I'm out here supporting the End the Fed protest rally in Nashville, September 22nd, in front of the Federal Reserve Building. And for many decades now, the John Birch Society has been promoting the ending of the Federal Reserve so that we can get back to constitutional money system based on gold and silver currency. We cannot continue printing money as the Federal Reserve does. Someone has said that gold is the money of kings, silver is the money of gentlemen, barter is the money of peasants, and debt is the money of slaves. We need to stop being debt slaves.
I mainly came out here to really address the Federal Reserve System. It may not sound relevant, but I like to grow potatoes. You know, I'm a little bit of a farmer. And real wealth comes from production and savings and hard work. And when these politicians come up and they say that wealth can be printed out of nothing without work, you start scratching your head and saying a little bit, do you remember what your parents taught you whenever you were a child is that if something seems too easy, then it's probably a scam. And that's what the Federal Reserve System is. It's a big Ponzi scheme. It reminds me of GMO seeds. GMO seeds are very easy to grow. Doesn't take a whole lot of work. They're not prone to diseases, but they actually cause cancer when you eat it. And the Federal Reserve System is a cancer. They claim to be able to spread wealth unlimitedly, to an unlimited extent, but what they're actually doing is diluting the wealth. It's almost like if you have a can of Coca-Cola and you keep adding in drops of water, eventually the Coca-Cola is not going to be brown anymore. It's going to be water. It's going to be diluted. It's going to be watered down. And that's what's happening to your currency. The harder you work and the more you save, you're actually losing money on the back end because the value of the dollar is going down. And that's why I'm out here today to raise awareness on this issue. A few years ago, there was a partial, not a full, but a partial audit of the Federal Reserve, and it was discovered that about $16 trillion got lent out to foreign governments and corporations free of interest, no questions asked, permission was not asked from the American people, and that should scare a lot of people. If trillions of dollars being printed up and distributed to these wealthy aristocrats and we have no say in it, we should be very angry, and I am very angry.
Federal Reserve, may you rot and burn in hell. Yeah! May the walls fall and may I live to tell. May all the world reject your fake cash. You stole our wealth, but we can take it back.
The Federal Reserve is not federal, and there is no reserve. It's no more federal than the Federal Express. It's a private cartel of banking magnates. It was formed by an act of Congress. It can be abolished by an act of Congress, but it must be done in a very methodical way. We must replace and substitute fiat currency with gold and silver currency. By the way, 14 states have introduced legislation to do just that, to have gold and silver be the payment for debts. And Utah right now is the only state that has passed that completely. Tennessee has brought it up, but it was not passed. Georgia as well, Colorado, and various other states. So at the state level, we can continue pushing this, getting back to constitutional money. It doesn't have to be, we can also push to audit the Fed, like in the Senate bill that's currently being held up by Senator Harry Reid. We need to get behind that as well.
If Harry Reid could see this, what would you say to him?
If he could see this, we would say get out of the way. Let's let liberty and freedom flourish. Let's let prosperity flourish by getting back to constitutional money. Let's follow the Constitution.
I would like to say that before you vote on a bill, consider two things before you vote on anything. Is it moral and is it constitutional? If it's not in the Constitution, you probably shouldn't support it. And if it isn't moral, then you definitely shouldn't support it. And the Federal Reserve is not in the Constitution, and it's immoral because you're stealing the value of people's money and production and savings. It's theft. My sign here says inflation is a tax, and it's a hidden tax, and it's an unconsented tax, and that really needs to be addressed.
Inflation has two meanings nowadays, and the original historical meaning was an increase in the quantity of money or credit. Sometimes people would use it, and so they would say like inflate the money supply. That's inflation. And but over the 20th century, the term sort of morphed, so people now think of inflation as meaning rising prices. And so as an Austrian economist, I think that's a bad development, because now when you're worried about rising prices, you don't know who to blame, when the blame really is the monetary inflation caused by the central bank and the commercial banking system. People lately have been worried about gas prices, and so what happens there is, I think Ben Bernanke's unprecedented interventions and expansion of what's called the monetary base by the Fed buying a bunch of assets, that has pushed up oil prices for two different reasons. So one is, other things equal, it makes the dollar weaker against other currencies. So even if Japanese drivers didn't notice prices at the pump going up in terms of yen, Americans would notice it just because the dollar would fall against the yen, because speculators are worried about the Fed expanding so much. That's one influence. The other thing is, in general, when central banks start inflating their money supply, speculators are going to rush into commodities. They're going to go into gold and silver and also oil, things that they think are going to respond to price inflation. They're going to do that before they're going to go into something like commercial real estate or something like that nowadays. So I think that's why you see this big spike in commodity prices after the Fed starts engaging in all these rounds of quantitative easing. And so that's a double whammy for why U.S. Oil prices and gasoline prices have gone up so much lately.
If we just sit back and say, well, it's been 100 years, and we're going to just have to deal with it and live with it now because we've been doing that for, we're agreeing that evil and wrongdoing, like pure evil and wrongdoing, is okay. We're just kind of like, oh, we can't do anything about it. Might as well live with it. No, we gotta fight that. That's what's jacked up our country. Is it gonna be painful? Yes, it's going to be painful when we fight the Federal Reserve. They're gonna pull some stuff. They're probably gonna drop some little bombs here at different places and blame it on the people in the Middle East. I mean, that whole Iran thing was a big hoax. Let me get this straight. A used car salesman in Texas is somehow going to get to the top of the government in Iran and make a deal to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. I mean, do you realize how absurd that sounds? And people believe it. It just cracks me up, man. Yeah, what I just said, is that not hilarious? We have a used car salesman who's going to work his way through the top political people in Iran, somehow get to the top of the government to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. And people didn't even question it. Some people did. I did. But the average person, oh, we stopped Iran from bombing the Saudi ambassador. And it just increased the amount of war propaganda, and it just justified even more why we should go to a war with Iran, and it just incited a little more fear in the American people over the Iranian people, like or over the Iranian government and the things that they could possibly do to us, like they could attack us. So no, it seems absurd to me.
Now, they also secretly finance things through international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. Two organizations that, I'll tell you what, if you're interested in individual liberty, you don't need the United Nations or the IMF protecting your liberties, because they don't do it. So the bailouts are going to the internationalists. It's not going to the people of this country. You're getting the burden. The middle class losing their jobs. The middle class are losing their houses. And this is the reason that we have to look into the monetary system, because it's through the Federal Reserve that the special interests get their protection. In 1913, of course, we had the introduction of the income tax. That guaranteed the ushering in of big government, and the income tax was supposed to be very small on a few rich people. Well, guess what? It's been here a long time. It's very complex. Nobody understands it. The economy is weak, and actually it's generating less revenues at this moment than they had hoped for. But the income tax is based on the assumption that the government owns all your money. All your income is owned by the government, and they will permit you to keep a certain percentage according to their rules. So the founders didn't invent that. This is ushered in the 20th century when our country embarked on big government. So this invited and introduced the notion of the entitlement system. So the entitlement welfare system blossomed in these last 100 years, but something else happened once we had this taxing program, borrowing, and also the inflation. It encouraged those, especially since World War I time, Woodrow Wilson period, that we had some type of a moral obligation to not only make the world safe for democracy, but to promote our so-called goodness, even if it took force and occupation and wars. By golly, we're going to force it on the all foreign countries. My suggestion is that philosophy is wrong, occupation of other countries is wrong, nation building is wrong, and we ought to just come home.